Hi students, in this video I'm going to discuss the social unrest and changes that we see taking place in 1960s American society. And we begin with 1968, so more towards the end of the 60s, although the events that I'm talking about in this lecture video are results of a process that we've seen throughout the 1960s and through the second half of the 1950s. We begin in 1968, considered one of the most traumatic years of the most traumatic decades in American history. This year sees the assassination of both Martin Luther King and of Robert Kennedy, who is running for president for election that year. And these assassinations are kind of a climax of a growing sense that American society is unreformable by some people at the time. That some people saw some reformers were increasingly losing faith in the ability to reform American society without totally destroying it and remaking it. And these assassinations kind of contribute to that sense. And so we start to see in the aftermath of the 1968 election, Richard Nixon's victory, we start to see the rise of what's known as the New Left. Not so much in terms of what the goals of the New Left, but more in terms of its methods and where it is found. It is found in college campuses predominantly, and it begins with students in increasing numbers protesting the war, protesting being drafted to fight a war, protesting the violence of the war. And so we start to see in the actions of the students, who are the baby boomers, now grown up and become adolescents, a dissatisfaction with their society, that they've grown up in this very wealthy society, but that it's not providing them with fulfillment. And so they want to stamp their own mark on this society, and they see their calling, and this is speaking in very broad terms, but the protest groups that we see arising in the 1960s that have not been seen before in American history, see their calling in American history as to encourage greater personal liberation. And so they see traditional structures of authority within society, the family and the government, as agents of oppression. So they describe parents as first oppressors. And so what begins as protests against the wars are part of a much broader movement against traditional sources of authority in society. And with some groups like the Weather Underground, this is more radical. These are calls for violent actions to overthrow and to change American society. In some, like the Students for a Democratic Society, it's more focused on protest. But either way, it's this rejection of American society of the 50s. And so if we move to think about the countercultural movement, this personal liberation that these students are trying to achieve and trying to establish as the cornerstone of American society is best epitomized by dropping out of this society. Perhaps by not even voting, certainly by not owning a home, perhaps by not entering the workforce. And this personal liberation countercultural group is also associated with the word hippies, that you find fulfillment in not engaging in causes like trying to defeat communism around the world, but that you find fulfillment in your own personal liberation and fulfillment. And in being able to act entirely as you wish. So that means openness to recreational drugs, recreational sexual activities that previously had been taboo in this society. And an effort to create what they describe as a classless society. So this is communism, but not imposed by the state, but instead being driven by popular culture. And we see this in particularly in the music scene. We talked about this in the 50s, but there's certainly even more true in the 60s. You have events like Woodstock, these concerts that are supposed to be free love events with drugs, sexuality, and a sense of returning to the land and returning to agrarianism, driving these sorts of movements, efforts to create communal living that is not based around a family structure. And so these are the ways in which the protest groups of the 1960s are trying to change American society. One of the most lasting and one of the most powerful of the movements within this broader cultural change is the feminist movement that we start to see developing in the 60s and into the 70s. And this is what's called second wave feminism. First wave feminism we've talked about a little bit in this course already. It's the movement to gain the vote for women. And this is successful back in 1919. Fast forward to 1960, and the focus of feminists is not so much on women having the right to vote as it is women playing the same roles in society that men do. And so the leader of second wave feminism, called Betty Friedan, sees the idea of the peaceful suburb and the homemaker wife of the 1950s as a regression. And she says during World War II, we had women who were out participating in the workforce, doing the same things that men did, and now we've kind of reverted to these bad stereotypes. She even describes suburban life as a woman's concentration camp. And so you have this rebellion against what has become established as the norm since World War II. Gloria Steinem, the other leader of the feminist movement who we're looking at this week, those are the two perhaps most significant leaders of this movement, is even more radical. And with her, we see a renewed focus on sexual liberation, the removal of traditional structures of authority that's more consistent with the more radical aspects of the 60s cultural revolution. In particular, the promotion of women's access to birth control and to abortion. These she promotes as ways for women to control their bodies, as necessary for women to control their bodies, and to live the same lives that a man is living. And so these are the ways in which the 60s you start to see a revolution against a social revolution against what had become established norms in American society.